Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. It's easy to flatter me. That's one of the professional deficiencies that you have, right? You, as an academic, you are maybe not born, but you grow into some kind of megalomania quite naturally. So this is very nice. Captain von, yeah. Who is this other guy? Is this Captain von Traps, right? The Traps. How did the song help me out on the song? Yeah, so I'll take the song. Yeah, but Edelweiss, Edelweiss. Yeah. Okay, so I'll take this song. I'll show this to my girls. I will be happy. Yeah. You might do other things and train them, like running like the soldiers. Into the morning appeal before breakfast. Yeah. Well, so this is the last lecture of the Mises University. I'm again your Omega. I've been your Alpha, and I'm again the Omega. Mises as model. Okay, so I've written a book on Mises. I should be able to say a few words on Mises as a model. He's a model. In my book, I've tried to render him homage where it was due. It's tempting. It's almost a part of academic etiquette. If you write a biography on some scholar, any personality, that you show your distance, your critical distance, so it makes it more scholarly, you're detached, and so on. But I think this is an excess. It's not warranted by the task that we face in science. Of course, we have to be faithful to the truth, and this is the main point. But we need to give thanks where thanks are due. We need to need to express our admiration for a person when a person genuinely merits our admiration. Now, this is of course not a scientific statement, but it's a personal statement that doesn't diminish anything of the academic value, as I hope, and in fact, as I'm sure, of my Mises biography. So Mises definitely is a person that commands our admiration in many respects, and can be our model as a scholar, but also as a man. So in my talk, I will very briefly address first Mises' function as a model, as a scholar, and then turn to the man, how the man can also inspire us, and probably should inspire us to an even greater extent than Mises as a scholar. I will also explain this. So Mises as a scholar, he excels by his commitment to that which should be the first commitment of any scholar, namely truth. This should be a matter of course, but unfortunately it is not. I've already related at one of our luncheon discussions how a few years ago I went with one of our summer fellows to a Southern Economic Association conference, and so we were presenting papers and discussing papers, and this summer fellow was a very brilliant young man. He commented on a paper delivered by an assistant professor from New Orleans, saying that the model she had used and the econometric program she had applied was not fit to substantiate the conclusions to which she had come in her work. So it was an overgeneralization. And then the response he got was remarkable, because the response was, but everybody is doing this. Okay, everybody is doing this. It was charming because it was a very open and honest response of what ultimately is underlying much of the research, in particular in economic science, which is a field that I know a little bit, but unfortunately also in other fields. Way too often, the commitment to truth is undermined by the necessity to respect the habitudes or the fashions, the methodological kowtows that are necessary to make a career in the profession. In order to become an economist hired at one of the major research universities in the United States, I don't need to name the names, you know them all, it is necessary to publish in a certain number of journals. Unfortunately, publishing in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics will not bring you there. It might not hurt, eventually, in some cases it might even hurt. Having an article published in the QJAE might prevent you from getting into some of these places, but in any case, it's not sufficient to get you into these places. You need to have publications in certain other journals. And in these other journals, the commitment, there is, of course, a commitment to truth not completely undermined, but the paramount commitment is to certain methodological principles. So if you do not go into econometric modeling or mathematical modeling, you will not get your paper published. It's very simple. So the question is no longer whether the means that we employ in our research are fit to attain the end. The ultimate end is to learn something about the real world. The question is, do you fit into the model of what a fashionable scholar looks like? And if you don't, you're not likely to make it. This is, of course, a grave deficiency, but the good thing from an Austrian point of view is that this is a market niche. And if the other guys weren't screwing up that much, we wouldn't get this audience. And so this audience has been growing over the years, and it will grow ever further. And ultimately, of course, we will win. Of course, the quest for truth is a very satisfying quest. This is a very fulfilling, ultimately much more important than gaining $10 or $20 or even $30,000 more per year. And I always, looking at the guys working at fashionable research universities in the US, some of them actually like what they're doing, so they're happy, that's fine. But some of them, they stop publishing as soon as they get tenured. What does this mean? Well, they're really fed up with their work. They don't like their work. That's what it means. They don't do this because they derive personal satisfaction out of this. They did this only to get to this position. As soon as they are there, they drop the pen and just go ahead and teach a little bit. Now there they are at a prestigious institution, and they earn a little bit more than colleagues at other places, but ultimately they are unhappy wretches. That's really what they are. And so we shouldn't envy them. There's no reason to envy an unhappy person who has dedicated his life, has spent his life on something that he really or she really doesn't like, doesn't believe in. It's much more safe way to personal happiness if you focus on something that you're passionate for. And if you can make money out of this, you can earn a living with this, all the better. And this was also the case with Mises. And his quest for truth let him accept the sacrifices that are necessary. He made a career to the best of his abilities. He would have loved becoming a professor in Vienna, tenure professor and so on. He didn't get there. Okay, this can happen. Did not diminish his passion for economic research, for economic analysis, and he went on until eventually he worked out some scheme that worked for him. Didn't live in great riches, and he was, especially I told you, when he arrived in the United States, he got some sort of a stipend, and so at the age of 60 he was paid like a postdoc, coming freshly out of the university. And then later on, it didn't grow much beyond this, so maybe doubled his salary or something as compared to this, but it was still way below what he had earned previously in Europe. All this was of comparatively lightweight for him as compared to what was really important in his life, what he was passionate about. And this is something that we should keep in mind. And our passion for truth should not be mitigated by concessions that run counter to this objective. So Mises accepted great sacrifice to pursue his path. He also, the two most important areas in which he stuck to the truth, but thereby had to accept the sacrifice of being excluded from the scientific community, were politics. His insistence that economic analysis leads to free market conclusions, and the second one was methodology. It doesn't make sense to try to derive policy conclusions from purely historical research. So today we would say purely empirical econometric research, because after all, the econometric movement is nothing but some sort of neo-historicism. And he didn't make any concessions on mathematical modeling either, right? So this is not the way to arrive at economic theorems. So he was out of fashion on both grounds. And if we look at what's going on today, this is still the main stumbling block, especially in Europe, right? The country where I'm teaching, France, is a particularly striking case. Very few libertarian scholars, very, very few. And in economics, if you are not into mathematical modeling or econometric research, you're out of the community to some extent too. And in the United States, politics is a little less important. Right? You can get along with libertarian convictions, but if you're an Austrian economist, this will bring you into great trouble. So this needs to be known beforehand. This is the sacrifice to be made. But it's a sacrifice not in the sense of Ayn Rand, right? A meaningless giving up of happiness. It's the cost that we pay to attain a greater end. So it's worth a while. Right? The value that we attain is, as always, higher than the value of the means that we employ. Second, Mises focused on the important issues. You can be passionate about truth, but look for truth only in marginal areas where you make a marginal contribution. Right? You study the love life of the snowy buck or something like this, of the Alabama roach. You have a commitment to truth and you find out true things. That's perfectly fine, but it's not really important. Right? So here values come into play. Right? We can do science, of course. Science, the logic of science is independent of our value system. But science is of any value to humanity only to the extent that the scientist, the economist, or the physicist, whoever, focuses on something that is important for a great number of people. So we have to focus, and speak in an older language, on the common good. And this should always be our starting point. It doesn't mean that in every single step we should only analyze things that are important for the man on the street or for all scholars or something. Sometimes we have to deal with methodological issues, or we have to deal with little problems of interest theory and so on. Right? But ultimately, this is just an element that somehow should fit into the greater picture that should be something important. So the common good should guide our efforts, and it did certainly in the case of Mises. Mises was always ready to be subservient to the common good. This is a source of satisfaction. He got one of the letters that I found while doing my biographical research. Well, it was funny because it was of one of the students, female students that was in a seminar, and she said, well, you who are known as the great champion of individualism, you are sacrificing yourself for the common good. Found this paradoxical, but it was not really paradoxical, because these were the things. The common good was important for Mises as a person. That's why he stayed under fire in World War I on the front. That was his place. He didn't like this place, but that was his place, so he had to fight the fight there. And later on, life put him in different places, in the Chamber of Commerce, where he had to withstand political fire of all the inflationist parties. So you need to say, well, inflation is a disastrous policy. We need to resist this. He resisted this and was creative in developing new arguments that showed, and a new analysis that showed these detrimental effects. And as a visiting professor at New York University, etc., he stood the ground. In this context, I might point out that, well, speaking of Mises as an individualist, Mises was the first one also to insist that liberalism, or more precisely classical liberalism, is not the philosophy, as he saw it, is not the philosophy of individualism. He argued that it's not correct that the philosophy of liberalism benefits the individual, or more precisely only the individual at the expense of the functioning of overall society. Mises' point was that we can show with the help of economic analysis that is whatever point of view we adopt, whether it's our main concern is the individual or whether our main concern is the operation of society, the common good, free market policies, non-interventionist policies are always preferable to interventionist policies. This is something that you find in his book, Critique of Interventionism. It was first published in 1929. We have a recent edition, I believe, or in any case there was an American edition in 1977. That's the one that I use. There might be some more recent stuff. And so he stresses this in arguing with the socialists of the chair in Germany. And who say, well, this is an individualist point of view. If we adopt the collectivist point of view, we arrive at different conclusions. No, said Mises, that's not true. Whatever point of view you adopt, you cannot justify interventionist policies. And that's also why Austrian scholars have always been interested in analyzing phenomena that really truly emerge on a collective or an aggregate level, such as money, for example. And if you have just one individual, there is no such thing as money. And you need to have many individuals that are using it. Language, law, etc. Mises has a very important book that he published in 1919, A Nation, State and Economy, the major chunk of which is absorbed with an analysis how language emerges, is propagated, and finally dwindles also in society. So language is something that is not individual. Well, it's spoken, of course, by individuals. It survives only to the extent that individuals speak it. But it's a phenomenon that can only be understood if we consider the relationships that exist between individuals. So especially those phenomena, even if we focus on those things, in which a purely individual point of view is not sufficient to understand the phenomenon, even there, and we arrive at exactly the same conclusions on a political level. So we focus on the important issues. We try to create a coherent big picture. This is the third point that is exemplary in Mises. He always tried to get to the big picture. One of his main contributions to the history of thought, and of course in particular to the history of economics, is to have written Human Action. Human Action does not contain very much new stuff. There's new stuff in there. And I've mentioned some of the points that were new in my speech at the beginning of the week. But Human Action for the first time gave us a Misesian view of the economy and of society as a whole. And this is of the utmost importance, both on an intellectual level, but also on a practical political level. It doesn't help much if we have different pieces of analysis and also different pieces of policy conclusions that are somehow juxtaposed without anybody knowing how they relate to one another. They could be contradictory. And it is important, just as in the case of Adam Smith, who has provided a worldview very different from the worldview emanating from the writings of the mercantilists, that you have somebody like Mises, and later on Rothbard also, who provides a worldview, something that is way beyond economics, and helps us to situate both our own work and the problems that we face, the relative weight of the problems that we face, on a practical level and also in purely intellectual undertakings. And this is something that we should strive for too, every one of us, whatever our field. When we're economists, each of us should try to, maybe not to publish a book like Human Action, it takes some genius to do this, but a book that covers the total of our field, whatever the field are in which we are working, explaining how it relates to other fields. This should be the objective, whatever, for the age of 60 or something. Right? This is where we should be. We should start gaining a view of the interdependence of all phenomena much earlier. We can do this because, happily, we have works like Human Action help us doing this. But Human Action is a work of science, it's a human work, so it's imperfect, needs to be improved, needs to be updated in the light of new experience, in the light of new discoveries. So every 50 or 60 years, you need some major other human action, or maybe every 100 years or something. Right? But everyone, of course, this is something that can come about only if we have a culture in which we cherish the importance of a global view of things, a big picture culture. We need to have a big picture culture. The fourth point in which Mises served as a model as far as a scholar is concerned, he disagreed. And actually, my impression was always that he liked to disagree with his colleagues. He disagreed with his colleagues, and actually in his research he tended to focus on precisely those points on which he felt they were most wrong. Kind of a sadistic attitude. You know, spot this weak spot in your opponent saying, yeah. But of course, it was not sadistic. Right? It was, the point was not to hurt anybody's feeling, and I will say something about this in a minute. That was not the point. The point was, of course, not to look for trouble and see, is there any imperfection? Of course, there are lots of imperfections. But to see if there is a systematic flaw. And you see that a whole profession is deviating in the wrong direction, or an entire society is on the wrong track. You need to identify those very spots, those articulations where they go wrong. And this is precisely where you need to work, even if it hurts. That's what Mises was doing. So he saw that the entire profession was going wrong because of a wrong methodological focus. So he focused exactly on this. And even though he came personally from a completely different culture, from a completely different intellectual tradition, he was raised in the tradition of the historical school, very strong empirical bent. And I told you at the beginning of the week that he was always absorbed at the beginning of his professional career with industry studies and so on. So lots of number crunching, lots of field studies and so on. Even though he came from there, he did not generalize this and glorify, say, well, this is how everything should be done. He saw precisely that this is not sufficient. And he insisted, well, there is such a thing as a priori laws that cannot be verified or refuted by reference to observable things. And of course, he disagreed heartily on economic policy. There's also something on which the West has gone terribly wrong, especially in the first half of the 20th century. Things have improved since then. As we all know, we are not in perfect shape, far away from this. But we're no longer in 1920, that's all I can say. 1920, in Europe there were various countries, many countries in which socialist and communist governments were taking over. This was the fashion of the day. Much stronger than today, even the Green movement. And everybody wanted to be a commie. And we forget this. Mises was all alone. So it's way easier for us today, right? I mean, the Green movement is comparatively heteroclite, right? People are much more receptive to free market ideas. Our job is way easier on the political front. But we have a lot to do, a lot of things to do anyway. So Mises disagreed. And the other way of going about science, and again, this is in the interest of every beginning scholar, is not to disagree, but to make marginal contributions based on the work of the predecessors that are in the field. And I do not encourage you to disagree with your research director. You go back to a university, you do a PhD, the first thing is you tell them, well, how deficient his knowledge is, especially of praxeology, and Austrian Economics doesn't know the first thing about this, and so on. That's not the right way to go about this. No. And Mises, by the way, didn't do it either, right? He didn't get his PhD by telling his professor, well, how much they were ignorant of the things that they should know, and so on, right? That's not how you do it. And even his next book, right? Theory of Money and Credit, although there were already beginnings of Misesian disagreement. But the point is to keep this in mind, right? That this is not the way about making an important contribution to the common good by just making marginal contributions, especially in a situation in which the profession as a whole has gone astray. Now, I mentioned that Mises did not enjoy getting personal, didn't enjoy hurting other people's feeling and so on, and in fact he did his utmost to avoid this. Very early on in his career, he was confronted to a situation in which he was denied a promotion, And he was wondering why this was so, why there was resistance coming from this area, or there was not denied a promotion, but it was heavily criticized. So he was wondering, why is this so? He was heavily criticized on his monetary views. Couldn't explain it in the light of the evidence. And he found out that he was criticized because he was opposing a practice that involved some corruption. Okay, so he was opposed to certain monetary practices, but the monetary practices were just a cover-up for a corruption scheme. So that was ultimately the reason why he got fired. So the question then was, should he expose the corruption or not? And he decided for himself not to do it. Decided to fight arguments and ideas, not persons. Now, this is a very personal decision. I would not say, well, this is the only way to go about this. For example, Murray Rothbard was the opposite model. Right? Murray Rothbard would go after the wrong ideas and after the person too. Double burial. Right? Depends on your person. Right? In the case of Mises, so in any case, he showed us that it is possible to make an important contribution even if we do not go after persons. He has been a model for me in this respect. I always try to avoid this, never go after persons, always go after wrong ideas. But again, I wouldn't say this, everybody has to do this, but it is possible to do this and make a very important contribution. If you are a journalist, nobody will listen to you, or few people will listen to you if you are making a case against an idea. Right? But it might be more important to focus on persons. Depends on the situation. So this was Mises as a scholar, what I find, so a few points that I wanted to single out. Now let's turn to Mises, the man. And the Mises, the man, as I mentioned, can be a model for us in more important respects than Mises, the scholar, because the point for all of us is not somehow to imitate Mises, or to be his clones, or just live the life again, look for another communist government that we could combat or something, or another great inflation, right, and so on, God forbid. But to transpose his way of going about problems into our own lives, to see things that are of validity there and take this as a model for our own lives. So, because again, it's a professional handicap, right? Someone need to systematize things. So my system is always the cardinal virtues. Okay, and the cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and moderation. And I think in all four virtues, Mises is something to give us. We certainly excelled in the the virtue of prudence. The virtue of prudence is not the virtue of timidity, carefulness, and so on. Prudence is the virtue of circumspection. And again, we see it certainly in the fact that he tried to arrive at a general picture, tried to bring into all of his considerations a view of the interdependencies of all things. Not only to focus on one little aspect, but to see things in their context. Certainly excelled in the virtue of prudence. Prudence also involves the virtue of being able to anticipate things. He anticipated lots of problems. He saw where monetary policy would lead Austria. He was able to stop this in 1922. And precisely because he had the virtue of prudence combined with the virtue of strength that he was able to stop this. He anticipated the outbreak of the Great Depression in 1929. He anticipated the inflationary path that American finance was about to take after World War II, etc., etc. He was of great concern for the future of the West. Things have not turned quite as bad as he had reason to expect in 1973, but that was also, among other things, because he himself had laid the foundations based on which others then would help turn around the West and ultimately the rest of the world away from socialism and away from communism. So there was this revolution of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States at the end of the 1970s and the early 80s. This would have been unthinkable without the work of Mises, who himself had influenced those people who were more directly involved in engineering this revolution. Hayek, and others. Mises excelled in his commitment to justice, although justice was one of the subjects on which he did not like to talk, right? Mises rejected the idea of natural law. There's no evidence that we have for natural law. It was a Benthamite as far as justice is concerned, so only social utility determines which policies should be imposed by the law. There's no other justice than the one that comes from the government. Mises was not an anarcho-capitalist, but a classical liberal. But still he had this commitment, and it also showed up not only in his public dealings, but also in his private life. Mises tried to treat employees justly, and he tried to support them also to the best of his abilities. And promoting people, well, not promoting people, but yeah. For example, he was one of the first professors to systematically work with female students. And female women got access to the universities of Austria only after World War I, which was about 25 years before they got voting rights in the UK. And the professors were, as a rule, very reluctant to work with them, promote with them, and Mises was one of the first to direct their PhD dissertations and so on, got them into positions with the local industrial organizations and brought them into international organizations. The one virtue where Mises stood out most was, of course, the virtue of, next to the virtue of prudence, was fortitude or strength. Right? Because he benefited from this virtue that he could hold out under fire. He also commitment to truth, and not everybody benefits from this virtue. Not everyone has this in himself, but Mises did have it. Again, that's why he held out in the Carpathian Mountains in 1915, and that's why he held out in, well, after all, marginal positions in academia when the fashion was running the other way. Mises lived all of his life a moderate life. So we have no traces of alcohol excesses, womanizing, excessive smoking, though he was a smoker, etc., etc. But of course, the virtue of moderation, of course, is the virtue of the market. It's the excellent virtue of the market, because on the market everything needs to be balanced somehow, right? We don't overdo things because it would be a waste of resources. We would lose money. We shouldn't underdo things because we would lose a profit opportunity. So it's natural that somebody who's close to the market would excel in this virtue. But of course, you can also overdo it. Right? It's a very dangerous virtue. The virtue of moderation is not the one of the middle ground. The virtue of moderation is the one of finding the right balance in all things. And Mises, again, he saw himself always as a public figure, so his life was a public life. And being moderate meant to find the right spot for him, given the overall context. It does not mean to be moderate or middle grounder and so on. You remember that he wrote this famous essay, Interventionism or Interventionist Policy. A middle-of-the-road policy leads to totalitarianism. Right? So he was not a middle grounder, he was one person of balance, and the balance was defined not only by his personal life, but by the overall context. And this is certainly something that is very, very difficult to achieve. In a way, it's easier for somebody like Mises, who didn't have much of a family life. He got married very late, was 58, never had children. There's stepchildren only, who were adults by the time he got married. So this made it somewhat easier. For most of us, it's a little bit more complicated, because we do have families, we do have a professional life, so we are also called upon to make contributions as citizens, and to bring all of this under one head is difficult. But Mises showed that it is possible. it's possible for him to do, it's possible also for other people to do this. And the art here is not to fall into this middle ground position on moderation, but to be extremist there where it's necessary to counterbalance a wrong trend in the rest of the world. That's exactly what Mises did. So this was a little overview. Again, Mises has found lots of admirers in the world. There's one virtue that I didn't mention that concerned him as a scholar also in particular, is the ability to write clearly. Straightforward. It's also an expression of his mind. It's always very straightforward. We talked about this when playing soccer, and one German guy was always shooting directly. Each shot, one goal, was not me. And then my French student Xavier said, well, this is the German way of going about this. One shot, one goal is very efficient. Mises wrote clearly, always directly on target. You don't lose time making kowtows left and right and so on. You say what you have to say and express it in a way that is accessible not only for your colleagues, so it's an intramuros debate, but for all of the world. And this is something that I hope you will do in the future, whatever your writing will be in, that you write in such a way that it's accessible not only for people working in a discipline, not only for people working within austro-libertarianism, or the Austrian school. We shouldn't have our own lingo. We should express ourselves always in a way that is accessible to all people of goodwill. And this will finally bring us to victory. And with this, I'm happy to close this summer university. We have a few minutes for questions, I see. So you're happy. I'm happy to take any questions. You are exhausted, right? I know. Okay, we'll have a nice barbecue later on, and we have especially the oral exams for those who are ready at 2:30. Yeah, but I saw a question over there. Was it Mr. Owen or somebody? Did you have a question? Did you have a question?
Was there historical connection between Hayek and Mises in the late 20s when they were both kind of developing their capital theories a little bit independently, but to some extent, Hayek was maybe using some of Mises' work that didn't contribute to that?
Well, in those days, Hayek's starting point was different. He was a student of von Wieser's, right? So let's say his methodological approach was slightly different, but what he took over from Mises, and more or less took over completely from Mises, was the research agenda. So Mises was in those days especially interested in monetary economics and the theory of comparative social systems. So the whole socialist calculation debate in particular. And those were the topics that Hayek also took up. There were other things like rent control, on which he made contributions very much in the spirit of Mises, but in the way he expressed it and he went about it was slightly different. And those were also the very days when Mises started writing on methodological issues. So it took Hayek a few more years to start doing this then too, but it became also common ground.
You mentioned how Mises focused on the interaction between individuals. I have a very old professor at my school that said the bottom line in economics is profit, the top line in economics is people. I was wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as a business firm is concerned, of course, that's true, right? This might not be the only objective of a firm, but it's certainly the one objective that a firm must have, because that's the purpose of a firm, to earn monetary revenues for all members of the firm. Now, does this mean that this is the only criterion? Certainly not, right? For example, purely from a legal point of view, a firm must respect essential rights of employees and so on, otherwise it could not continue operations. But it's also in the interest of the firm to live up to those ideas that are cherished by the employees. You have a company, whatever, that is full of greens, so environmentalists. Of course the management has to accommodate this in one way or another, right? The products must be green enough, and suppliers, and also in the way you talk, and so on. So the person is ultimately always paramount in social organization. If you wish, even in firms, though it's a necessary condition that you go after profit, it can become relatively less important to the extent that the market permits. Of course, if competition is fierce, you've got to focus on the main mission. Yeah.
Are you saying that because of the, for example, extended to sort of like education, saying that, well, the market is all this mathematical hogwash, right? And so, but just based on, you want to sell your services into the market, you have to sort of turn a blind eye to something like that. For example, that the green firm.
So you have to turn a blind eye on?
Sort of like turn a blind eye and say, okay, I can't be a pure, like, let's say, like, rationalist or something like that. Because I do want to have a dissertation, I do want to get funding, I do want to do this.
No, I mean, this would, there's a cost in this case, right? You could still follow your ideals, but of course you would have a cost to pay. It might, for example, if you're a complete libertarian and you're living in New York City, or some other socialist environment, or semi-socialist environment, of course, social relations a little bit more difficult, right? You could spend the entire day just arguing with your colleagues, but that wouldn't make it particularly productive. Or you would have just to swallow what they have to say all day long, even though you don't agree, so you swallow this is the cost, you go about your business, right? But there's never really any necessity to compromise on your ideal. Right? But the point here was simply, what is paramount? Is a profit's paramount or a person's paramount? Ultimately, it's always persons, because all interactions derive from the value of persons. And as entrepreneurs, in what is good and what is bad, we've got to take account of this.
Since you wrote so much on Mises and studied him so much, have you come across anything, I don't want to say that he regretted doing, but have you ever come across anything you wish he would have done differently or wish he would have done in his life? Or?
No, I mean, already Mises didn't have a diary. Right? So you have people who are writing diaries, and they confide to the diary their innermost thoughts and so on, what they hold really important. Sometimes they say one thing in public, and to the diary they confide the truth. But Mises didn't have such thing. Right? He had this kind of a little notebook in which he would just mark which people he meant. It was an agenda, right? No. So I never found this thing. In a way, of course, it's also regrettable. I would have loved to relate some juicy love stories and so on. Would have made the book more interesting, right? and of course, he did have love stories, but there's no trace of this. I have 3 love letters. Okay. The only reason I have 3 love letters is because this stuff was stolen by the Nazis. Okay, he himself destroyed any such thing. His wife kept letters. Okay, so she kept the stuff. So therefore, we have some traces there, and of course, we have her book. But otherwise, there's nothing of personal. Also, financial dealings, honoraria, and so on. What we find in the letters always. Oh yeah, we will talk about this next time. No written trace. Yeah, sir. Yeah.
As a scholar of Mises, what would you venture to say he would be saying about the current state of affairs in the world right now?
Well, as I have said before, at the time he died, all we could have is a very dire outlook on the world. And the United States in particular, but the world at large. The Soviet Union existed. There was a Cold War, and in many instances, a hot war being waged in Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world. It was not clear how the confrontation would end. The United States had just imposed price controls on a massive scale under Nixon, so everything was going the wrong direction. And since then, okay, there are the neoconservative revolutions that I've mentioned, right? Thatcher, Reagan. But we also had the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had the complete change of orientation in Chinese politics. China joined the world economy. We have an enormous increase of the world economy. We have an enormous spreading of free market ideas already before the internet, but exponentially so after the creation of the internet. So things have dramatically improved by any standard. So given this, Mises would see, I mean, these things have improved. We could not deny this. On the other hand, one cannot deny also that there was a heavy cost to pay for the long-standing inflationary and socialist policies that we have led, and which have left their mark on the mentality of the American population. Americans are no longer the same population today than they were in 1970. Way not as self-reliant today as they are in 1970. This is way not as work ethics and so on has seriously suffered. Now, not only in the US, but I just talk about the US because it's the most glaring example. And in Western Europe, it's the same thing. Right? The welfare state destroys morals. We cannot deny this. So there's lots of depravity. Turn on the internet, you will find out very quickly. Right? So it's a mixed picture. But we have hope. And we're in a better position, much better position than before. Morals turn around eventually, right? It gives a nasty picture, and also it doesn't help when things turn sour. For example, if you have a major crisis. It's precisely in a major crisis when you need morals. When everything goes well, you earn ever more riches every year. Okay, you tend to forget about morals. Right? But it's precisely when things are difficult that you need them. So it's a mixed picture. But there's hope. Sir, yeah.
I was curious whether you could give a quick summary of the time you spent in Russia doing your research on the war.
Oh, in Russia I've been just 3 or 4 weeks. I went into the archive. I was a well-paying customer. Russia at the time was in full disintegration. It was the end of the Yeltsin years. It was in 1998. Okay, 1998, June of 1998. And so they gave me a translator, they gave me a room to work. I paid $1 per copy. Made them a millionaire, right? So it was very efficient work. So the way I went about it was, so they gave me the total list of all the items according to their list. And I had to correct this later on. And I told them I want a full copy of this and this and this. And that I could have just gone in and say, well, you give me a full copy of everything. Then I'll go. You leave after whatever, 3 days. But they were unwilling to give me an entire copy. So I had to make a selection. There was some political negotiation of how much I could get, but I got pretty much everything. Because they were counting everything, but they didn't know what really was important, what was relevant. So I got virtually 100% of Mises stuff. And for example, what you would have is, they were counting every single page of a journal in which one article by Mises would appear. So I take just 10 pages out of 100, it's just 10%. Right? But I get 100% of what is relevant for me. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
How do you think Mises would feel if you were to learn that the overwhelming majority of the people that work for the Mises Institute are anarchists?
How I would feel about this?
How would Mises feel about this?
Yeah, he would probably be shocked. Yeah. But, right, again, he would find this shocking, but again, that's the kind of deviation I think that he would have tolerated much more lightheartedly than the communist or socialist deviation. Right? This I would say, okay, this is just youthful exuberance or something. Like in the case of Rothbard, I mean, it's just okay, it's just wrong. Okay, but I mean, it's better this way than the other way. They will find out very soon that they need a government, so they bring it back.
How did you become so efficient?
I'm not. Yeah.
Since I've been here, I've talked to dozens and dozens of people, conversations across the board, and I found that, true to form, people are very dogmatic and opinionated, which is great. It's a beautiful thing. But I found sometimes, it almost can bring people to the precipice of irrelevance and impracticality. They're not going to take part in the democratic process or contribute to certain, causes with money or, stuff along those lines. And I've been thinking, that I don't think we can win like that. What would you say to those people?
Well, first of all, I would say there are different ways to lead one's life. Right? So there are different balances. You need to find a balance, but the balance can be different. It's not because you refuse cooperation in the democratic process that you can make no contribution to the common good. Right? But it's also wrong to chide those who do this, take part in the democratic process, use this as a venue to make our ideas felt, and say, well, this cannot give any good. So I would find both things wrong. It's a kind of a practical, misguided practical dogmatism. Right? As far as dogmatism in general is concerned, of course, yeah, it's important to hold on to the truth, stand one's ground. But of course, as scholars, it's also important to be always critical. Right? It's not, we cannot just fall asleep. We have Mises now and everything is solved for all times. No, we need to go on, constantly work on this, read our opponents, even if it doesn't seem to make much sense, as in the case of Paul Krugman. Right? Paul Krugman, from time to time, as we say in German, even a blind hen sometimes lays an egg. Right? So there might be a pearl of wisdom hidden in 1,000 pages of Krugman. Might be. So, to the extent that this is so, we should pick it up and develop it. Right? We should not leave a pearl of wisdom to the wrong people. Well, okay. Thank you for your attention.